Thanks for coming along on this lovely evening. Sorry for dragging you out inside and from this lovely weather. So today I'm going to talk about the land border in Ireland 100 years on. I'm actually going to bring it right up to date, up to the Windsor framework. So it's going to be 100 years, kind of even more actually when we talk about fiscal independence, when that concept came up. So I'm happy to take any questions or comments afterwards. So this will probably take about 40-45 minutes. For many, the partition of Ireland only truly began with the establishment of the land border due to the arrival of customs barriers 100 years ago this year, on 1st of April 1923. Before then, partition was seen primarily as an administrative burden. With the creation of a physical border through approved and unapproved roads, customs huts, customs officers, checkpoints, forms and signs, partition became real and tangible. Today, I explore how the physical manifestation of partition through the creation of a land border had arguably the largest impact in driving division between North and South in cementing partition. I look at how the nature of the border changed in the 70 years of the land border prior to the rollout of the EU single market in 1993. This is from the initial phase of adapting to a land frontier that had not existed before, from the smuggling industry developed during the 1930s economic war and of rationed goods during the Second World War, to the targeting of custom stations and posts during the IRA's border campaign of the 1950s, 1960s, and the enhancement of the border security infrastructure during the Troubles as the land border became a site of conflict. In contrast to reduced levels of customs barriers, as both Ireland and the United Kingdom joined the European Economic Community, the EEC, was part of a new phase of European integration that enabled closer cross-border relations between all member states, including Britain and Ireland, as well as North-South on the island of Ireland. The turn of the 21st century saw the nature of the land border transformed dramatically, becoming to all intents and purposes a frictionless border, as the deepening European single market accompanied the post-1998 Good Friday Agreement. The prospect of a hard border between the UK and the EU has been one of the most complex consequences of the UK's decision to leave the European Union following the Brexit referendum in 2016. With the prospect of some form of home rule for Ireland becoming realistic from the late 19th century onwards, there was much debate in Ireland and Britain on the future financial relationship between the two, if home rule was granted. Internationally, there also was much debate on the merits of protectionism versus free trade. Even if Ireland was not to be offered a different customs policy, the need to have its revenue counted separately implied the need for customs barriers to provide accurate information of what revenue was coming in and out of Ireland. Shortly before the Third Home Rule Bill was introduced in 1912, Arthur Griffith, in his newspaper Sinn Féin Weekly, claimed home rule would be a sham if Ireland was not granted fiscal autonomy and control over its customs and excise. Under the Government of Ireland Act 1920, there was to be no divergence in customs policies nor customs barriers between both Irish jurisdictions and Britain, as the British government claimed customs barriers would lead to increased division and prevent the eventual unity of Ireland, which it proclaimed was its ultimate goal. It was planned for the income of both Irish jurisdictions from customs and excise duties to be estimated as a percentage based on population of the overall income of the whole UK. For Northern Ireland, the only part of Ireland the Government of Ireland Act became operational in, customs checks were still put in place between it and Great Britain, however, to determine its allocation of customs revenue. So when the DUP say there's never been an Irish sea border before, they're wrong. There actually was customs checks on the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland for much of the 20s and 30s. And here is a customs declaration form required to be completed on dutiable goods crossing the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Anyone shipping goods from Northern Ireland to Great Britain and vice versa throughout most of the 1920s and 1930s were subject to customs checks across the Irish Sea. In a Belfast newsletter article from April 1922 entitled "Why We Are Foreigners," it was reported that a British Postmaster General stipulated that any parcels posted from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and vice versa from May 1922 also needed to complete a customs declaration form with particulars of the contents for statistical purposes. While the Northern Ireland government defended such customs checks used for the sole purpose of apportioning revenue, its Ministry of Commerce regularly had to issue statements to British media outlets about the misapprehension regarding the procedure to be adopted in shipping goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, as many British exporters believed Northern Ireland had the same status as the Irish Free State, where certain duties on goods existed. Other than the confusion the customs forms caused, some complained about the complex details and measurements needed to be included in the forms, which they felt was strangling business between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Fiscal autonomy was offered to Arthur Griffith, something he dearly cherished, and the Sinn Féin plenipotentiaries by British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, just hours before the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed, the early hours of 6th of December 1921. While little attention has been paid to the financial clauses of the treaty, their impact was far-reaching. They allowed the Irish Free State to devise its own fiscal policies and tariffs separate from Northern Ireland and Britain. The provisional government of the Irish Free State, on the brink of civil war, asked the British government to act as agents of its revenue for the financial year 1922-1923 before it pursued its own fiscal policies. It then created the new Department of Revenue Commissioners and sought help from the British to train its staff and to provide templates and manuals on how best to run its revenue department. As a key symbol of independence, the Irish Free State was determined to diverge from the British fiscal space at the earliest possible opportunity. Although aware of the implications such a decision could have on the border between the Free State and Northern Ireland, the Free State government felt it had no choice if Northern Ireland opted out of an Irish customs union, but to erect customs barriers along the 300-mile-long land frontier from Lough Carlingford to Lough Foyle. Presented with a choice of remaining within the UK fiscal system or joining an all-Ireland one, Ulster Unionists emphatically chose the former. The Northern Ireland Prime Minister, James Craig, was totally opposed to and asked the Free State government to cancel customs barriers for all time, stating the Free State would be responsible for partition and not Northern Ireland. On top of seeking fiscal independence from Britain and to generate revenue for the Exchequer, the policy was also an attempt to apply economic pressure on the nascent northern jurisdiction. The Free State-sponsored North-Eastern Boundary Bureau claimed the erection of a customs barrier would gravely imperil the future prosperity of Northern Ireland and would extinguish the enormous distributing trade Belfast does with the rest of Ireland. Here's an almost full page from Anna Herald devoted to the claims from the North-Eastern Boundary Bureau. Like the naive and destructive Belfast boycott policy before it, many in the Free State believed the economic pressure caused by customs barriers would force the North to end partition. There are striking similarities between the decisions made 100 years ago and today relating to the land border, including the British government's apparent indifference to Northern Ireland and Unionist interests, Ulster Unionists' desire to remain closely aligned with Britain, strong opposition from key business sectors to the erection of trade barriers, and the lack of preparation on how such far-reaching decisions would impact on people's daily lives. The decision to introduce customs barriers was announced to the public in late February 1923, to be enacted just weeks later on 1st of April, leaving very little time for people and businesses to prepare. The arrangements were agreed between the Free State government and the British government, not the Northern administration, who had no control over customs and excise. In practical terms, the importing and exporting of merchandise across the border was prohibited, except through designated routes and at designated times. Here's a list of approved roads, customs stations, and boundary posts. Customs stations were open for the clearance of merchandise between 9 AM and 5 PM daily, except on Sundays and public holidays. Farm produce was exempted, as was the removal of household furniture and small domestic supplies of non-dutiable goods. Cross-border roads were labelled as authorised concession or unauthorised, unapproved. Every railway line crossing the border was approved for importation and exportation of merchandise. People wishing to move merchandise across the border had to submit a carrier's report to customs officials, where the actual goods were tracked against a documented amount and the relevant fees were then gathered. Although there was free movement of people due to the common travel area, agreed between the British and Irish Free State governments earlier in 1923, those who crossed the border had their person and personal effects examined to prevent smuggling. There was widespread disapproval of the decision, north and south, particularly from those closest to the border. It is generally felt that the new customs barriers would lead to an increased cost of living for consumers, considerable confusion, and lengthy delays in the handling of traffic. As 1st of April drew closer, the physical signs of the new measures began to appear. Declaration forms were issued at railway stations, proclamations appeared in newspapers, signs and posters displayed in prominent places. Construction began on customs huts and stations along the border, many of them temporary in nature initially. Staff were hired to man the new stations. Railway companies hired extra staff to meet the extra demands. There's an image from the Times of London showing a busy scene at Dublin docks in late March 1923, as many rushed to land goods into the Free State before customs barriers were introduced the following week. Days after it was introduced on 1st of April, the real effects of the customs barriers began to be realised. The new arrangement led to increased congestion at ports and border controls, with goods awaiting clearance, leading to heavy losses and disruption to businesses. It resulted in the closure of some border companies reliant on cross-border trade. The customs barrier severely curtailed the movements of residents along the border. Railway services suffered considerable disruptions, with some lines zigzagging the border on numerous occasions, with customs examinations initially expected for each crossing. For example, a train running from Clonus to Cavan crossed the border 6 times in 8 miles. Common sense soon prevailed, and it was decided to curb the examinations to just the first point of entry beyond the border. The trade barriers introduced in 1923 had a negative impact on trade. In one high-profile example, Henry Ford cancelled a visit to Ireland in protest over tariffs and customs barriers, claiming he had hoped to build cars for all of Europe at his Cork factory, but moved his car-making operation to Manchester instead due to the Irish Free State's trade barriers. The consequences of the new measures were most keenly felt by the border counties, Donegal economically cut off from Derry, Down and Armagh from Louth. One company close to the border, Dundalk Distillery, issued a notice to its 150 employees saying they no longer had jobs as the new customs barriers prevented them from selling their products in Northern Ireland and England. The once vibrant commercial town of Clonus in Monaghan slumped economically as shoppers stopped crossing the border from many places in Fermanagh and started shopping in places like Enniskillen instead. Days after the customs barriers came into operation, the Irish Times predicted that Enniskillen will lose a large trade with Cavan and Leitrim, but it will be more than compensated by the keeping of the home trade, which formerly crossed the border to Belturbet and Ballyconnell. Some industries, such as tobacco and confectionery, saw immediate benefits from the protectionism offered by the customs barriers, with English companies such as Imperial Tobacco and Cadbury's subsequently building factories in Dublin to supply the Free State market, hiring thousands of people in the process. The creation of the land border in 1923 undoubtedly added a high degree of permanency to partition. The physical machinery of the customs barriers helped to cement it. The introduction of the customs barriers made it tangible and real. The formalisation of the land border saw long-established economic and social ties drastically impeded. As such, it was that much easier for the Boundary Commission to retain the status quo in 1925. The confusion and complexity of creating a land border in 1923 offers notable parallels with what happened in 2021 when the Irish Sea border became operational through the Protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland. It also helped explain why unionists are concerned at the long-term effects of such disruption on economic and social ties between Britain and Ireland. The Economist magazine hoped in 1923 that economic and political wisdom would save Great Britain, Northern Ireland, and the Irish Free State from the costly and irritating burden of a land customs frontier extending over hundreds of miles. As customs barriers were about to be introduced, it claimed that while they may not lead to a trade war, they could preempt the Boundary Commission's decision on changing the border. The Free State government also accepted creation of a land frontier may be regarded as stereotyping the present boundary line between the Free State and Northern Ireland, and might to that extent prejudice our decision before the Boundary Commission. However, with there being little prospect of the Boundary Commission convening shortly afterwards, and with it the potential to reduce or remove the border, the Free State felt it needed to pursue its own fiscal policies at the earliest possible opportunity. As customs barriers were being erected in March 1923, Ulster Unionist MP Herbert Dixon stated that if it suited the government of the Irish Free State to put up a Chinese wall around themselves and sit as mandarins inside it, that was their funeral, not ours. He also hinted at how the decision could impact on the Boundary Commission, saying if they carried out their intentions, it would dispose of the Boundary Commission question if it ever existed. They were going to set up their posts at certain places, thus creating a boundary and recognising it. What court of law could then proceed to say that it should be elsewhere? When the Boundary Commission finally did convene from late 1924 to 1925, many of the submissions, both verbal and written, focused on the impact the recently created customs barriers had on people's daily lives. Actually, you can check all of these files at the UK National Archives. You don't have to go to Kew London either. You can actually just look them online, all the Boundary Commission submissions. Here's one from Reverend J.R. Mara, who lived in the Dromully salient in Monaghan, which is almost completely enveloped by Fermanagh, claimed in a submission to the Boundary Commission that he used to shop in Clones before barriers were put up, and since then he started to shop in Newtown Butler. A submission from the Protestant residents in the Donegal part of Petticoat requested for their area to be transferred to Fermanagh, in part to facilitate trade and to partially remove the present troublesome customs barrier. The chairperson of the Boundary Commission, Justice Richard Feetham, described it as the terrors of the customs barrier, continuously referred to it in his questioning, and of the damaging consequences it would cause if the boundary line underwent further changes. The Manchester Guardian newspaper contended that not only was the customs barrier making it difficult for the Free State to persuade people to transfer from Northern Ireland, but so was the increased taxes and cost of living in the south compared to the north. The Boundary Commission submissions offer a rich first-hand account of how the land border was experienced by people on the ground at the time, so soon after customs barriers had been erected. Both Unionists and Nationalists, in their submissions to the Commission, went into some details on the effects the customs barrier had on their daily lives and livelihoods. While Unionists believed the placing of a customs barrier north of where they lived would lead to large financial losses and considerable inconvenience, Nationalists claimed they were already suffering from the effects of the customs barrier by losing customers from their hinterland in the Free State. Asserting their economic prosperity lay with the Free State, Nationalists sought for the boundary line to be drawn northwards. As with today, political considerations often triumphed over economic ones. After the tripartite government agreement in December 1925, following the debacle over the alleged leaking of the Boundary Commission findings, to retain the boundary as it is today, there was much speculation that a customs barrier would also go. At the time, Republicans, as well as the Cumann Gael government, were determined to maintain the land border as a sign of nationality and to force Northern Ireland into union through loss of trade. Conversely, Ulster Unionists were opposed to the land border then, with Craig leading the calls for the ending of customs barriers. Notably, in many ways, roles have been reversed 100 years on, with Nationalists seeking no return to a land border, while many Unionists now prefer a land border to the Irish Sea border imposed under the Northern Ireland Protocol and Windsor Framework. There was much comment at the time in the Irish Free State of English stunt newspapers, such as the Daily Mail, which was dubbed the Daily Whale by one Irish newspaper, exaggerating the impact of the customs barriers with their glaring captions and subtitles, referring to it as a reign of terror for tourists and traders and a place of adventure for smugglers. It's also striking how short-sighted and dogmatic most strains of nationalism were at the time on how best to achieve Irish unity, not realising the harm customs barriers were causing in achieving this professed goal. It is similar to many of the claims made now against Ulster Unionism, particularly the DUP, that its policies, from its initial support of Brexit onwards, have hampered Northern Ireland's position within the UK instead of strengthening it. Smuggling was a feature of the land border the moment it came into being, as people used all means at their disposal to avoid paying duties or to escape higher prices. The Scotsman newspaper claimed that Irishmen are temperamentally well endowed for that sport of smuggling. The land border led to some very inventive and in many cases comical ways to avoid customs, including men dressing up as women to avoid searches, a woman eating a full cake at a customs station once she realised it was dutiable, another woman drinking a pint of whiskey at the border to avoid paying duties, and a man wearing a pair of trousers made of newspapers after discarding beautiful cloth-made trousers from a train. One farmer claiming he was smuggling another man's wife in his cart was told by a customs officer he could pass on as she was non-dutiful. Another example of someone trying to smuggle a person across the border occurred at Black Line in Cavan in 1937, when a 30-year-old man working in the circus was caught by guards trying to elope with a 13-year-old girl, also working in the same circus as an acrobat. Many real-life examples undoubtedly provided inspiration to Spike Milliken for his comic novel Puckoon, which offers a satirical viewpoint of the impact the land border had on people's lives. In a series of articles in the Irish Times in July 1930, a reporter wrote on how the introduction of duties on wearing apparel has influenced to a considerable extent the fashions among the women of Donegal. A type of what used to be known as the Ulster coat, which is long and loose, is now greatly in vogue, and it is worn on all shopping expeditions, even in summertime. A Donegal farmer's wife claimed that all the women entering Derry from this district go in as lean kine and return resembling fatted calves. We place the garments we purchase on our bodies, tighten ourselves up as much as possible, and generally escape the notice of the officer. The nature of the smuggling changed, though, particularly after Eamon de Valera's Fianna Fáil party came into power in the Free State in 1932. Shortly after taking office, de Valera claimed that partition was disastrous for Ireland and that the customs barriers were costly. By his government cancelling its annual payment for land annuities to Britain, as required under the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty, customs barriers along the border became more prohibitive and costly. The decision to withhold land annuities payments resulted in the British government imposing duties on farm livestock and produce from the Free State for the first time, which in turn resulted in the Free State imposing duties on UK imports such as steel and coal. The resulting economic or tariffs war continued by varying degrees of intensity until a trade agreement was reached between both states in 1938. There was opposition in Britain to the government decision, with future Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee calling on both governments to negotiate instead of engaging in a costly tariff war that was injurious to both sides. The economic war saw a huge upsurge in smuggling, particularly of cattle from south to north. Prices for cattle plummeted in the Free State. Smuggling cattle into Northern Ireland became a minor industry. Many farmers were forced into smuggling by fear of bankruptcy or loss of farms. There was also a large increase of smuggling of other animals, including horses and greyhounds. Some nationalists saw it as a patriotic duty to engage in smuggling. Despite political pressure not to do so, many unionists also participated in smuggling. Records suggest that approximately 100,000 animals were walked or swam across the border in 1934-35. In Cavan and Fermanagh in particular, smuggling by waterway afforded secretive access denied when the heavily policed land border was crossed. The swimming of cows between south and north was widespread as they followed the cots, which their drovers ferried to the islands of Lough Erne. For those who were caught and prosecuted, the repercussions could be severe, with heavy fines imposed and the suspect items impounded. To avoid paying higher duties on livestock, false declarations were also made on the age of animals. Customs officers were later trained on how to tell the age of cattle by examining their teeth and observing the suckling status of pigs. The Daily Mail embarked on a crusade in the 1930s, lambasting the British government for its feeble efforts in preventing cattle smuggling, which was damaging loyal Ulster farmers, and recommended a wire fence along the frontier, coupled with a strict system of visas and papers and a much larger force of customs officials. To curb the wide-scale smuggling, the British government introduced the Finance Act 1934, which created a prescribed area adjoining and within 40 miles of the land border, where any person in possession of uncustoms goods could be required to furnish proof that the goods were not imported from Free State or that duty had been paid. Subsequently, the Northern Ireland government complained that the area prescribed for proof of dutiable goods and the searching of persons and premises relating to customs was far more wide-ranging and punitive than in the rest of the UK, mainly because Northern Ireland had the only land frontier in the UK. This provides a good early example of how Northern Ireland was treated differently to the rest of the UK due to its land border with the Free State. More customs officers also had to be hired, and both An Garda Síochána and the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the RUC, as well as the beef specials, were deployed more extensively. Customs officers and police became targets for violent attacks in the 1930s, with police being stoned and customs huts burned and bombed. In negotiating the Anglo-Irish Trade Agreement of 1938, Britain urged the Irish Free State to accord special trading concessions to Northern Ireland, both as a gesture of conciliation and to stem protests from Northern Ireland politicians. However, De Valera argued that such a concession would give Northern Ireland the best of both worlds, partition plus a favourable opportunity of expanding its trade and era, opening the floodgates to intrusive competition. In the end, no concessions were made for Northern Ireland in the treaty by the Irish Free State. Similar debates about whether Northern Ireland should be granted the best of both worlds have been very present in the initial developments of the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland. With the signing of the Anglo-Irish Trade Agreement in April 1938, most people hoped there would be less duties and a more invisible border, decreasing the amount of cross-border smuggling as a result. While there was a big fall-off in the smuggling of cattle, the nature of duties and subsequently smuggling changed due to the onset of the Second World War. During the war, smuggling became more prevalent than before. With strict rationing of goods in both Irish jurisdictions, even though the 26 counties were neutral during the conflict, smuggling occurred frequently on both sides of the border. There was widespread smuggling of household items. Many Northern Irish residents travelled south on the sugar trains or the butter express. Much of the smuggling during the Second World War was conducted by women. In one instance reported by the Daily Mail, hundreds of pounds worth of beauty products were seized at Dundalk Station in 1942, resulting in girls bursting into tears when they were asked to hand over boxes of powder and lipstick of fashionable brands which cannot be bought in Britain. The availability of luxury clothes and cosmetics from the 26 counties during the war was demonstrated also when two male RAF officers were caught at Ballykin, Fermanagh after crossing the border with a large quantity of ladies' corsets and stockings. The Second World War also resulted in the temporary cancellation of the common travel area between Ireland and the UK. The border was hardened by the curtailment of cross-border traffic after Northern Ireland government introduced travel identity cards and announced an order on the Rich Civil Authorities Special Powers Acts, stipulating that anyone travelling to Northern Ireland from outside of the UK, including Ireland, had to satisfy the RUC that their presence in Northern Ireland is essential for the purpose of transacting legitimate business of national importance. Travel restrictions were also imposed between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK for the duration of the war, and this actually lasted on 1952, as well as the need to carry identity cards when travelling over the Irish Sea. You won't hear that from the DUP either. The Northern Ireland government considered this arrangement vexatious, but are no doubt necessary for purposes of defence. The British government refused to relax the travel requirements from Northern Ireland to Great Britain in the immediate post-war years, as the travel identity cards prevented undesirable aliens from the continent from reaching England by the backdoor method of passing through Eire. Once the need to show travel identity cards was removed for journeys between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, advertisements started to appear in British newspapers inviting people to visit Northern Ireland, stating there was no currency restrictions, no travel permits, no passports, no customs barriers. As Ireland was being partitioned, there was violence along the border, particularly in the first half of 1922. Some obstacles such as checkpoints and the cratering of roads were deployed along the border, limiting the ability of people to cross the border freely. Such obstacles were temporary in nature though, and freedom of movement was resumed before the more permanent customs barriers were introduced in 1923. While there were sporadic incidents of violence along the land border in subsequent years, the concerted campaign by the IRA from 1956 to 1962, known as the Border Campaign or Operation Harvest, saw the land border become the site of conflict, as the IRA specifically targeted customs posts and personnel, as well as other public buildings. The IRA's border campaign occurred at a time when there was much public agitation for an end to partition, following the Republic of Ireland Act in 1948, which saw Ireland leave the British Commonwealth, and in response to UK Parliament's Ireland Act 1949, which stated that Northern Ireland would not leave the UK without the consent of the Parliament of Northern Ireland. While many in Ireland declared there should be no recognition of partition, others, such as Irish Shamet member James Green Douglas, claimed partition was already being recognised by customs posts, welcoming people to the Republic of Ireland. He also commented on the ridiculousness of claiming ERA comprised the whole island of Ireland on the one hand, to Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution, and notices at the land border informing visitors they are entering ERA on the other. He reminded these fellow senators that diseases such as tuberculosis and foot and mouth do not recognise borders or customs posts, something also regularly referenced in recent times during the foot and mouth outbreak in the early 2000s, and obviously during the COVID-19 pandemic more recently. Douglas called for all-island cooperation and special preferential tariffs for goods made in Northern Ireland. With the IRA destroying infrastructure around the border and some custom stations in general need of repair, debates took place in the Oireachtas on the merits or not of repairing custom stations, with some claiming that doing so was a form of recognition of partition, while others stated that while partition on the border exists, it was important to create a good first impression for visitors entering the state at each first point of entry. The Northern Ireland government responded to the IRA's border campaign by authorising the RUC and British Army to barricade, block or crater roads along the land border to prevent the IRA from crossing it. Spikes taken from tram or railway lines were also used for the first time. From 1956 to 1962, over 200 roads were closed, leaving only 16 points of entry between the two Irish jurisdictions. While the road closures negatively impacted on the daily lives of farmers, doctors, traders and shoppers along the border, most unionists welcomed the disruption the closure had on IRA activity, while nationalists complained of the problem caused by the closures. As customs checks were being diminished due to Ireland and the UK's entry into the EEC, ease of movement across the land border remained prohibitive at the time, mainly due to the Troubles, when the land border was constituted as a security as well as a customs barrier. On reading Colm Tóibín's Bad Blood, A Walk Along the Irish Border, his memoir of walking the border in 1986, the striking the prominent physical features of the border he remembered were military ones: spikes, cratered roads, watchtowers, checkpoints, British Army personnel and transport, and not related to customs. There is little mention of customs stations and officers, of signs and forms. The militarisation of the border had taken over from the customs barrier. The land border as a site of conflict was visible through the deployment by the Irish Army of field hospitals and refugee camps at the border, the attack on customs stations and officers, and the cratering and spiking of roads by the British Army to prevent IRA incursions across the border. Locals responded by filling in craters and removing spikes, a process that was repeated many times on some border crossings. Military checkpoints, as well as army watchtowers, and in some cases barbed wire, were features of the northern side of the border for much of the Troubles. In one of the worst incidents of 1972, the deadliest year of the Troubles, an IRA bomb detonated prematurely at the Newry customs stations, killing 3 IRA members and 6 civilians. 4 of them were customs officers. There were also incidents of the British Army crossing the border, travelling to customs stations in the 26 counties that were a considerable distance from the actual border. The land border and customs barriers also featured as part of the campaign to legalise contraception in Ireland in the 1970s, as well as the decision for the punt to be decoupled from sterling in 1979, resulting in currency exchanges at the border. In 1971, after travelling to Northern Ireland to buy as many contraceptive pills as they could, members of the Women's Liberation Movement were confronted by Gardaí and customs officers at Connolly Station in Dublin. Instead of handing over the products, the women threw the contraceptive pills at the customs barriers and officers, garnering international coverage of their campaign as a result. After legislation was introduced in 1979, allowing contraception for family planning reasons on possession of a prescription, TD Noel Brown asked the then Minister for Health, responsible for legislation, Charles Hyde, what happens to someone who goes through a customs post with contraception, no prescription? Hyde jokingly, I presume, responded that they will be taken out and shot, resulting in him being referred to as the Ayatollah Hyde. Decades before the EEC was formed, there was debate in Ireland, Britain, and elsewhere of the merits of the European Union. In the late 1920s, the French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand's plan, the United States of Europe, was debated. Obstacles discussed included the need to overcome customs barriers, as well as the barriers on currency and language. Speaking in the Dáil in 1946, in comparing war-torn Europe to the United States, Fine Gael TD James Dillon stated that many of the problems the continent faced were due to barriers, customs barriers, immigration barriers, and monetary barriers. In the 1950s, with the founding of the European Coal and Steel Community, followed by the EEC later in that decade, the prospect of the removal of customs barriers within Europe was regularly cited in Ireland as a potential avenue to do likewise in Ireland, as well as bringing an end to partition itself. Fine Gael TD Patrick Cooney believed that joining the EEC was a way of ending partition peacefully through the removal of the physical manifestation of partition, customs posts and barriers. During Ireland and the UK's long campaign to join the EEC over the following years, many assumed the land border and customs barriers would immediately vanish once entry to the EEC was granted. At the same time, relations between the two Irish governments, led by Sean Lemass and Terence O'Neill, improved considerably. This resulted in agreements over tourism, customs posts, and the removal of the requirement for a triptych pass to enter either jurisdiction. As a sign of a reversal of its protectionism stance, and shortly after EEC entry was thwarted, the Irish government signed a free trade agreement with the UK in 1965. The Northern Ireland Cabinet, wary of the North's position within the UK and how it faced unfair competition over the land frontier, believed it was not unreasonable that Northern Ireland should seek accelerated tariff reduction with the onset of the 1965 Free Trade Agreement. William Craig, founder of the Ulster Vanguard, and at the time Minister of Development, stated that since any agreement was likely to be disadvantageous to our agriculture, we should seek the best possible terms for our industries. The question could be considered as purely commercial, without constitutional implications. Special treatment for Northern Ireland could be justified by the proximity of the Republic across the land frontier. Here's an example of Ulster Unionists advocating for different trade arrangements to other parts of the UK, so long as Northern Ireland's constitutional position within the UK was not diminished. Speaking in the Dáil in February 1972, Ireland's Minister for Finance, George Colley, dispelled the assumption that customs posts would be removed once Ireland joined the EEC the following year, stating the removal of customs posts from the land frontier would not be a predictable consequence of our accession to the European communities. On the assumption that the border has not ceased to exist in the meantime, existing customs controls would have to be fully maintained during the transitional period of 5 years, when we will be moving towards complete free trade within the community in industrial and agricultural products. Also, customs control at the frontier would still be essential after the transitional period, for example, for the collection of fiscal duties, enforcement of import or export restrictions imposed for reasons of public policy, and for the compilation of trade statistics. While customs barriers remained after 1973, there was a considerable easing of duties and controls until they were completely removed in 1993, when the EU single market came into being. There still was much smuggling of household goods and drinks from north to south in the 1980s due to large price differences, where the Economist magazine observed that there were more Dundalk people in Newry than there were in Dundalk itself. With the decision taken in the 1980s to create a single market throughout the EU from 1st of January 1993, many in Ireland predicted that the complete removal of customs barriers along the land border would lead to increased trade between the north and south and would contribute greatly towards bringing about peace. Taoiseach Albert Reynolds referred to the importance of the EU to peace and north-south relations in 1992 through funding of cross-border initiatives such as the Belfast-Dublin Railway and the Ballinamore-Ballyconnell Canal, linking the rivers Shannon and Erne, and then through the removal of customs barriers. Referring to the ongoing Northern peace talks, he emphasised that the future of Ireland in Europe would be an important dimension of strand 2 of the political talks that are now underway. Some fears were expressed that the removal of customs barriers would lead to a huge upsurge in drug smuggling. It would be damaging to the environment due to the large increase of traffic it would unleash, and customs officers would lose their jobs. Loud Fianna Fáil TD Dermot Ahern claimed that 150 customs and excise staff in Dundalk and 14 in Castleblaney were in danger of losing their jobs with the removal of customs posts. Crossing the border remained prohibitive beyond 1993, though, due to the ongoing troubles. It was still militarised until the late 1990s, eventually broken down after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. Most physical reminders of the land border were removed, checkpoints and spiked roads gone, customs stations sold off. The removal of the physical features of the land border coincided with psychological barriers being removed too, as people and businesses began to meet and interact regularly, more so than had been the case since customs barriers were first introduced in 1923. For almost 20 years, the border was practically frictionless, with just the signage changes from kilometres to miles, the key indicator of crossing the road, of crossing the border even, and then came Brexit. The UK decided to leave the EU, partly because it did not want to have such open borders, nor in following EU rules. As a result, border controls between the UK and EU need to be placed somewhere to make sure that goods don't get into the EU that it does not want, inside its single market and customs union. Both the UK and the EU agreed, however, that it would be problematic to put border controls on the island of Ireland. This was for two big reasons. First, practically speaking, the Irish border has 240 official crossings. And secondly, in recognition of the peace process on the island of Ireland. A further complicating political reason not to draw a hard border was that Northern Ireland voted in a majority to remain. This is particularly true of nationalists, 85% of whom voted remain. The challenge was then how to manage border controls between the UK and EU without putting them on the island of Ireland. The UK and EU set as one of their top three priorities in the negotiations to withdraw from the EU, the border implications for Ireland. And they had a dedicated part of the withdrawal agreement, Boris Johnson's oven-ready deal, which, as we all know, has always been considerably less than half-baked, focus on meeting that challenge. The protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, which now looks very likely to be replaced by the Windsor Framework. The protocol and framework sees Northern Ireland follow some EU rules that would require border controls in order to avoid controls on the island. Instead, they come in goods crossing the Irish Sea. The protocol also sees protections for North-South cooperation across a wide range of areas under the remit of the North-South Ministerial Council, including on environment, health, transport and education. As a result of the complex, confusing and contentious efforts deployed to reach a solution, Northern Ireland's experience of the post-Brexit border has been one characterised by huge uncertainty and a return to political instability. As we mark the 100th anniversary of the creation of the land border in Ireland, borders in Ireland, whether on land or by sea, still remain a potent political issue on the island of Ireland and beyond. From looking back at events over the last 100 years in Ireland, it is clear that political decisions have often been made rashly, without considering the devastating and long-term consequences they can have on people's lives, particularly on those who live close to the border. That's it. So for next week, I'll be going back to at the same time, 6:30 here in Pearse Street, talking about the Republican hunger strikes of 1923. Yeah, that's at 6:30 on next Tuesday. So just on the talk you've given there in terms of books to read, shameless plug, I know, but the first book I recommend is my own book, Birth of the Border. One of my chapters I actually deal with business and trade, where I spend a lot of time focusing on the creation of customs barriers. Another great book I really highly recommend, Peter Leary's Unapproved Routes. It really gets to the nub of how the border was experienced by people on the ground, whether through customs barriers, through fishing, through even cockfighting. You know, it's a very innovative. It was his PhD thesis, which he's developed into a really good book. And then to answer, it's probably out of most people's range to buy. It's about 100 quid to buy the Partitioned Lives, the Irish Borderlands. It goes into the details of customs barrier as well, but it's probably cost about £100 sterling. So it's I'm not sure if you want to do that. So that's it. So I'm happy to take any questions or comments or even experiences of the border when it was